We'll be in Leviticus 1, 2, and probably chapter 6, and maybe a few other places this evening. As we get into this, I've titled this series, God's Definition of Holiness. And so I kind of want to start there. What is a good definition to you, one that you guys can use, of holiness? What do y'all think? Pure? Okay. So right off the bat, that's a comparison, right? There has to be something impure for me to know what is pure. Separated, separate. Any other definitions? How about from this side? Yeah, exhibiting the attributes of God. Very good. How do we know what the attributes of God are? He had to tell us. And that's the purpose of the book of Leviticus. We can get some gleanings of the law of Moses in the Old Testament, especially from other books in the Old Testament. But Leviticus is it. You want to know what God thinks about how his people should be holy, how they should be pure, how they should be set apart? You want to know how nitpicky he can be, and yet how sometimes he just paints with a broad stroke? It's Leviticus. That's where you're going to learn it. And so when we look at the Old Testament and the New Testament alike, if you want to know the mind of God, this is the book. The very first words are the Lord called to Moses and spoke to him. How many books in the Bible do we have those words, and then for the rest of the book, God speaks? It just doesn't happen very often. We have passages where God speaks, but this is it. You want to know the mind of God? Leviticus is it. You want to know how God wants his people to interact? Leviticus is going to help you understand that. And it's going to make things clearer in the New Testament. When he talks about being blameless, how do we know what blameless really means? Unless you have some understanding about how God's mind functions and how he thinks. Otherwise, I may run into the danger of using my definition of blameless rather than trying to fit with God's definition. So hopefully as we go along through Leviticus, that's going to become more clear. So that's the broad title. The working title is Leviticus. I'm going to call it that every time. That's what we're doing. My goal is to read every verse, maybe not in class, because I got to talk sometime. But I'm going to encourage you to read every verse as we go along. We're going to start with chapter 1, and we're going to start with chapter 2. But I want to do a little bit of background before we get in, because there's some terms I want you guys just to remember. One of them is I want you just to understand this is how the camp of the Israelites is oriented at this point in time. At the beginning of the book of Leviticus, the tabernacle is finished. And the children of Israel are at the point of, now what? And so when you organize and I don't need you to remember the tribes and their locations. That's not as important. For Leviticus, what's important is I want you to remember where the tabernacle is. The tabernacle has become situated in the center of the camp, and it is located in this orientation with the east, north, west, and south. That's important. If you read through chapter 1 already and you've done a little bit of looking with the burnt offerings, you're going to realize there's some directions, cardinal directions that are mentioned in there. And so I think that's important to remember. What side of the altar are we talking? We're talking, a lot of times we're talking the eastern side. And so if you're walking in the door, you're walking in the eastern side, right into the thing we're going to talk about here in a moment. So just keep those things in mind. When we get a little closer and look at the tabernacle, these are some of the parts of the tabernacle. I'm going to leave this slide up just so that you can continue to think about this is how it's situated, this is how it's oriented. The most important thing for our purposes today is going to be the bronze altar. So as soon as you come inside the curtain, you have the bronze altar, because that is, if you are a normal Jew, I'm going to call him normal Jew and I'm going to call him Levite Jew. I probably will come up with other names on other classes. That's just what's going to happen. But normal Jew comes in, all he's using is the bronze altar. That's it. He has no reason to walk around the tabernacle, meaning the outer courtyard period. He has no reason to go up to the bronze laver. He has no reason to enter the holy place at all, much less the Holy of Holies. He is concerned with that bronze altar smack dab there in the middle. It's pretty large, I think 9 feet or 10 feet, something like that, in a square. It's going to dominate his vision. And that is where all sacrifices are done. Now, later on in Leviticus, we're going to be concerned with another altar here. And that's going to be the altar of incense back here. Altar of incense is on the inside of the holy place. Therefore, a normal Jew never sees it. He's not allowed there. You have to be, at minimum, a Levite working around the tabernacle, but really it's the priests once they're anchored at their location. The priests can go in there. They're going to interact with these things. We're going to have a whole chapter on what happens if a priest doesn't use that altar correctly. That's in Leviticus. And note God's reaction to it. That's chapter 11, I think. We'll get to that in a few weeks. So those two altars are the ones I want you to keep in mind. Because when we're talking Leviticus in the first 6 chapters, we're looking at that bronze altar right there at the beginning, where all sacrifices are going to be offered. And you think about the quantity of people. I think I had population size on the one right before. This is a busy place. Let's assume only a handful of Jews every day are wanting to come in from each tribe. And you're still looking at a very busy location that starts off with Aaron and a couple of his sons. When I say a couple, I think it's 3 or 4. I don't remember how many he has. We're going to find out in a minute, in a couple of weeks. But that's it. We're not talking hundreds of them, like we will have in other periods of Jewish history. Just them servicing over 100,000, 200,000. I don't know. You guys do the math. You know, I'm not good at that. Okay, let's get into the text a little bit more. If you want to know more about the altar, you can look in Exodus 27, but I'm not going to go over there and look at it. Verse 1, the Lord called to Moses and spoke to him from the tent of meeting. Before we can talk about what's going on in the chapter, what is the tent of meeting? Okay, that's one answer. And occasionally, at this point, it not as often, but later on it's going to become much more often. The tent of meeting becomes the tabernacle. But at this point, we have another location. Let's turn with me, if you would, to Exodus 33. I'm grateful you said tabernacle, because it's going to be true later. But that's why this is important to take a look at. Because right now, God is not speaking from the tabernacle. And there's one simple reason why here at the beginning of Leviticus, God is not speaking from the tabernacle. It's not functioning yet. It's just a fancy tent with some fancy stuff in Leviticus in chapter 1. So in Exodus 33, if you look down in verse 7, let me get a volunteer, if you would, to read verse 7 through we'll do verse 11. Exodus 33, 7 to 11. Go ahead. Thanks.
Camp, far from the camp, and called it the tabernacle of meeting. And it came to pass that everyone who saw the Lord went out to the tabernacle of meeting, which was outside the camp. So it was, whenever Moses went out to the tabernacle, that all the people rose, and each man stood at his tent door and watched Moses until he had gone to the tabernacle. And it came to pass, when Moses entered the tabernacle, that the pillar of cloud descended and stood at the door of the tabernacle, and the Lord talked to Moses. All the people saw the pillar of cloud standing at the tabernacle door, and all the people rose and worshipped, each man in his tent door. So the Lord spoke to Moses face to face, as a man speaks to his friend. And he would return to the camp, but his servant Joshua, the son of Nun, a young man, did not depart from the tabernacle.
All right, thank you. I use ESV. That's why it says tent. Tabernacle means tent. So we're using similar terms here. But this is what we're talking about. Moses took a tent, calls it his tent, whether it's his personal living in tent or just one that he has. You can debate it. I don't care. But he takes it outside of the camp. And he calls it a special meeting place between him and God. And it is fantastic, isn't it? Like, when you look at all of Scripture, this is a noteworthy event, is that when Moses goes out here, he speaks with God. When he enters into this tent, the pillar of cloud descends and it stands guard at the entrance. No one enters this tent except for Moses. And while he is in there, how does God speak to Moses? face to face like a what? Like a friend. That is what's going on in Leviticus. We have God and Moses speaking to each other like I am speaking to you, probably more intimately than I am speaking to you. And he is explaining what the children of Israel need to be like, how they worship him, compared to how you might worship a Canaanite or an Egyptian god. How they set themselves apart, not just from other nations, but how they set themselves apart from themselves. We're going to talk about that as well, the separations of Jews for various reasons. How they separate themselves in regards to food. All of this God gives like a friend with Moses. And so you go back to Leviticus 1, that's the scene. This book is fantastic. It's unique. That's definitely for sure. Anybody have any thoughts before we delve into some more meat? Yeah.
When you think about God speaking to Moses as a man who talked to his friend, it reminds me of in Genesis when God is going out to see about Sodom and Gomorrah, and he visits Abraham first. And we get kind of this insight into God's internal dialogue where he's essentially asking himself, am I about to do this to Sodom and Gomorrah without telling Abraham, and decides that Abraham should know. But there in Exodus 33, there's a little bit of information about Joshua and that he would not depart from the tent. Is that all we know about that, or do we know anything else about what that means, that Joshua would not depart from the tent?
Not as far as I remember. It's almost a throwaway sentence. Like he's just standing there guard, and yet Joshua is the one selected next. So it is interesting that it occurs, but I don't know of any other passage that makes a big deal about it. Any other thoughts? Okay, let's get into the first of the offerings. In Leviticus chapter 1, verse 2, speak to the people of Israel, say to them, when any one of you brings an offering to the Lord, you shall bring your offering of livestock from the herd or from the flock. General principle, then we're going to talk about specifics. That's what he's doing here. So, by and large, if you're bringing an offering to God, it's going to either be of the herd or the flock. There's a few exceptions, like there's some birds that are going to be used. There's some grains and things that are going to be used. There's oils that are going to be used. We're going to talk about them, especially in chapter 2. But by and large, just if you're bringing an offering, you need to be bringing one of those two things. Some of the prophets even yell at them when they don't bring some of those things. The first one we're going to talk about is the burnt offering, verse 3. If his offering is a burnt offering from the herd, he shall bring a male without blemish. He shall bring it to the entrance of the tent of meeting, that he may be accepted before the Lord. He shall lay his hand on the head of the burnt offering. It shall be accepted for him to make atonement for him. Then he shall kill the bull before the Lord, and Aaron's sons, the priests, shall bring the blood and throw the blood against the sides of the altar that is at the entrance of the tent of meeting. Then he shall flay the burnt offering and cut it into pieces. The sons of Aaron and the priest shall put fire on the altar and arrange wood on the fire. And Aaron's sons, the priests, shall arrange the pieces, the head and the fat, on the wood that is on the fire on the altar. But its entrails and its legs he shall wash with water. And the priest shall burn all of it on the altar, as a burnt offering, a food offering, with a pleasing aroma to the Lord. So this is the introduction to offerings. And he starts with the burnt offering. The burnt offering is a little bit of like the backbone. It's used all over the place. In Scripture, Genesis has it all over the place because the rest of them haven't been codified yet. And so the majority of the sacrifices that you see in Genesis, when Abraham is sacrificing or Isaac is sacrificing, he's doing a burnt offering. The primary characteristic of a burnt offering is how much of it gets burned. So how much of a burnt offering is burned? All of it. Even the skin winds up being burned. So we've got, he flays it, he cuts it in pieces, he has to wash some parts of it, but the ending is all of it is burned. And we can see that. We see that with Abraham. Going back into Genesis, he does this. We see it in 1 Samuel, when they offer more burnt offerings as well. It's supposed to be a gift to God. Once they get into the land, and we'll talk about this in another passage in Leviticus, or I think it's in Numbers we're going to get to in a minute. Once they get into the land, then they're allowed to broaden out. And you're allowed to sacrifice at home if you're doing this one. This is it. This is the only one. But when they're in the wilderness, they're not allowed to. So we'll see it occasionally in the Kings or in the Chronicles or in Samuel. We'll see it occasionally in Judges, though I hesitate to use Judges as a proof text of righteous behavior. It just doesn't stand up well for that. But the burnt offering is the backbone of it. All of it is burned. What's the significance of burning all of it? It totally does. Like, we can see Christ's sacrifice in that. He gives all of it. But there's more to it than that. Because after all, to the Jew here in Leviticus, Christ is irrelevant. At this point, I don't think they even know Messiah is coming or care that Messiah is coming. This is the first time they've had a law with God. That's the most important thing coming down to them. So what does it mean for them?
To take an unblemished male bull and burn all of it, and you don't get any of it, is a big sacrifice for whoever doing it.
Yeah. And I want to hone in on, you said, and they don't get to keep any of it. They don't get any of it. Because a burnt offering sacrifice is about God. It's not about you. If you have a petition with God, there is a different sacrifice for that. If you have sinned and trespassed against God, there's a different sacrifice for that. If you want to give to God for the functioning of his priests, there's a different sacrifice for that. A burnt offering is not that one. It is simply an I want to give this to God sacrifice. I like to call it an I love God sacrifice. That's its whole purpose. When you look at its function, especially in Genesis, that's it. This is for God. It's because I love him. I'm not making a petition from him. I'm not asking for blessings. I'm not asking for someone to be cursed. I'm not asking for assistance. It is because I love God. And once they start moving away from that, and they start asking petitions, you start seeing things like the peace offering come in, when there is a give and chain, or an exchange that goes on, where the offerer gets something, the priest gets something, and God gets something, because now it's a meal. I'm getting a little ahead of myself, but I want you to understand the burnt offering is very unique. So when we look at the first one, which is the bull, we've got him cut apart, arranged on the altar. Who is doing the arranging, by the way? The priests. This is the formal burnt offering. Like I said, occasionally you'll see informal burnt offerings done as well. I think Jephthah is one of them who does. But by and large, if you're doing a formal burnt offering, you've come to the tabernacle for it. One priest is to preside. The other priests are there to assist. When you bring in the burnt offering, you bring in the bull, the first thing you do when you come in verse 4 is you lay your hand upon it. What happens when you lay your hand upon it according to verse 4? Yeah. It now stands in for you. It is to make atonement for you. Some of your translations may use that. It shall be accepted at that point. There's a transference here. This bull stands in for me. So if I'm bringing a bull as a burnt offering, and I'm allowing all of it to be burned on the altar, what message am I saying to God? All of me. That's my message. Later on, we're going to see different messages when you're laying your hand upon that because of how the animal is used on that altar. Look at the next section here, verse 10. Not a lot of difference here. If the gift for the burnt offering is from the flock, is the big difference. You've got from the sheep or the goats, he shall bring a male without blemish. He shall kill it on the north side of the altar before the Lord, and Aaron's sons, the priests, shall throw its blood against the sides of the altar. He shall cut it into pieces with its head and its fat, and the priest shall arrange them on the wood that is on the altar, but the entrails and the legs he shall wash with water, and the priest shall offer all of it, burn it on the altar. It is a burnt offering, a food offering with a pleasing aroma to the Lord. So we've got sheep or goat here. Still has to be male, still has to be without blemish because you're giving the perfect to God. But we've got some differences. Where were you when the bull was killed? Yeah, different side of the altar. We don't get a cardinal direction there, do we? We've got you coming in verse 3, he shall bring it to the entrance of the tent of meeting, that it may be accepted. He shall lay his hands, and they shall kill the bull before the Lord. So if you're coming in on the eastern side, this is where the bull gets killed. Probably for practical reasons. Bulls are big, so just get it done. Like, that's the message. We bring him in, we get him down, and we start everything. But you got some leeway with a sheep or a goat. You can move them around, you can get around people. And so what side are they supposed to use for that one? North side. So that one gets killed over here. Probably because there's a little bit of space over there, right? We don't want the bulls stampeding. We don't want them getting a little bit upset because it's smelly here. Blood is everywhere. Death is everywhere. So we're going to get them down as fast as we can, but you might be able to keep control of a sheep or a goat if you're a nice burly worker. I'm not, but they are. And so you can come up here. You can wait your turn, form a little queue, depending upon how many people are there, and that's where your sacrifice begins. At that point, one of Aaron's sons comes along. Aaron's sons kill it for you. And Aaron's sons throw the blood on the sides of the altar. We haven't talked much about that yet, have we? We've got blood on the sides of the altar. What did they do with the blood of the bull? Same thing. So, you've brought your sacrifice, they're draining the blood, and they throw the blood against the side of the altar. How much of the blood? Be brave. Some of it, all of it, the blood. I don't know how much. The way it reads is it sounds like all. But there's some practical things in the back of my mind that make me worried about that. Like if you got 4 bulls first thing in the morning, how are you still walking and functioning with just the quantity of blood that is now on the ground? On the other hand, think of that message. This is what worshiping God is. It's kind of gross. It gets you messy, gets you dirty, it stinks. It's not a fun time. Even though I assume once it's on the altar, it must smell better, because cooking food does smell good until it becomes burning good, and not so good.
The meeting, is that now referring to the tabernacle?
Yeah, now we're talking about the tabernacle. And that's the problem, right? That's why I said, yeah, occasionally it is, and then occasionally it isn't. When they're talking to each other, it's the tent of meeting outside. But now we're functioning as the tabernacle is functioning. That's the assumption that is being made. Yeah.
I've never offered an animal sacrifice, but I have killed hogs. And it does not smell good at all. I mean, the blood has its own metallic smell. The intestines that's the foulest smelling thing I've ever smelled in my life. The hair doesn't smell good. I can't imagine. We scald them, so I can't imagine actually burning hair. And you're right. I mean, this is messy. It's muddy. I mean, after a day of killing hogs, I am covered in blood. I've got pig hair all over me. There's mud everywhere. You're right. This is a messy and smelly operation. but God calls it a sweet-smelling aroma. And that just kind of really struck me as I'm kind of just visualizing what I'm used to. You know, we might do 6 or 7 hogs, and it's just a mess. I can't imagine doing 6 or 7 in an hour. Because I'll tell you, a cow puts out, 1,000-pound cows will put out a tremendous amount of blood.
Yeah.
And they stink. They stink when you kill them anyway. Pretty bad. So, but God says this is a sweet aroma, no matter how messy it is.
Yeah. And I think that's an important point when we talk about holiness. Holiness is not clean, even though we often describe it as being clean. This is holy. Charlie.
They're bringing these bulls?
It's per individual. At this point, yeah.
You're talking about maybe 600,000 men?
Yeah.
600,000 animals on the same day?
Probably not. This one is a voluntary one. They've got specific ones that they're going to do when they actually open the tabernacle. We're going to see that in a couple of chapters. But this is just generally, if you are struck with the desire to offer to God an unconditional sacrifice. Maybe something great has happened in your life. Maybe you've had a really good year, for crops or something, and you want to give back and you bring your animal, then you're doing it. So no, we're not going to have all 600,000. You could have a few hundred per day, especially once it kind of gets rolling and people get used to that idea. Yeah.
Well, there was a national sacrifice for the whole country.
Yeah.
In the morning and the evening. So that was the mandatory burnt offering at 9 in the morning and then 3 in the afternoon.
Yeah.
So there would have been others for other reasons, but those have been every day.
Yeah, there's always at least those, and I think they were sheep. Yes, thank you. That's what I was thinking. It was sheep.
It'd be 7 bulls.
Yeah.
Or 7 sheep.
Extra on the Sabbath day. Yeah. Yeah. And we're going to get to a lot of that later on in Leviticus when we look at all those regulations, but they're definitely coming. Yeah.
Another thing to remember too about this culture, animals were part of your family. They weren't bringing something that they went by a neighbor's house and picked up a pig on the way, or a goat. These bulls they had probably raised for calves. The bull would walk in there with it and leading it because they fed it or had it from its infancy.
Yeah.
So it was more of a personal thing when they had to kill something they owned that they loved. That was part of their wealth. Their wealth was indicated by how many livestock they had, and if they were dear to them. So that was really a personal thing. Besides being messy and bloody, and, that was in that culture. That was almost a part of your family.
Yeah, which is part of the accusation Jesus has with the money changers in the temple, is that people are coming and they're just buying it. That's part of the difficulty. They're not putting in any real effort. And in fact, in Leviticus, God's going to yell at them for doing similar. Don't just go and buy it from a stranger and bring it in. You can't just do that. Any other thoughts? Yeah, well, I got a whole bunch.
I was just thinking, since there's a lot of people witnessing this, and there's supposed to be a bull without any defect in it, and then when somebody offers maybe a young bull that's capable of producing offspring, that would make a lot of difference to them.
Yeah.
And I just wondered if that person would notice more than the others.
It could be. And later on, they're going to have some age limitations upon what is going to be offered. I don't think the burnt offering had one, though. Ben?
Say that I think when you're reading about this, the thought that comes to me where it talks about it being a sweet smelling aroma, or some render it soothing aroma, I really think the idea that I get from it is the obedience factor. That's what's sweet to God. Mm-hmm. The fact that you're obeying Him to the letter and doing what He asked of you. And then the translations that say soothing, I actually kind of like that better, because you're satiating God's wrath for the wrongs that you have done. You're transferring your wickedness to this animal and then burning it up representing that, repentance, that sort of thing.
Yeah.
Correlating it to what we would, talk about today.
Yeah, you're exactly right about the obedience. That's 1 Samuel 15 when Samuel yells at Saul. Saul's offering burnt offerings, and he says, God would prefer that you just obey rather than continuing to offer burnt offerings. Any other thoughts? These are great. Yes. And then
They have to do the killing themselves. Mm-hmm. You wonder how did they kill them? Did they cut their throat? Did they stab their heart? What did they do? When you think about that, all of the animals have to be killed by the person who's brought them in.
yeah. I was trying to think. I always assumed they slit their throat, but I don't think it didn't talk about it specifically here. Later on, it talks about ensuring that blood gets entirely out of an animal, and so that's the assumption I made was slitting of the throat. But you're right. Yeah, Dick?
One of the priestly jobs was to keep that altar of incense going, because in the mission it talks about they did a lot of work inside there with that incense to keep the smell from the altar going inside the tabernacle. Mm-hmm. And that would have been tough, as bad as that stuff would have smelled. So you have some pretty strong incense.
Yeah. Very true. Any other comments? Yeah.
Curiosity kept getting the best of me, but I looked it up, and average bull has about 10 to 12 gallons of blood.
So even if we're just talking about 4 in a morning, the quantity is spectacular. And if you remember that they don't move every day, tabernacle might stay in one place for years, and it just soaks there every day. Yeah.
Quantities don't decline. Eventually we're dealing with a permanent structure in the temple, and you see, Solomon, when he dedicates the temple, basically, sacrificing in one day all the cattle and goats that you might find in all of Murray County.
Yeah. Maybe even more. Because I think it even makes the point that it is without number. Like, yes. Got it good and bloody on its first day. Okay, let's look at this last section of the burnt offering here. If his offering to the Lord, in verse 14, is a burnt offering of birds, then he shall bring his offering of turtle doves or pigeons. And the priest shall bring it to the altar and wring off its head and burn it on the altar. Its blood shall be drained out on the side of the altar. He shall remove its crop with its contents and cast it beside the altar on the east side in the place for ashes. He shall tear it open by its wings, but shall not sever it completely. And the priest shall burn it on the altar on the wood that is on the fire. It is a burnt offering, a food offering with a pleasing aroma to the Lord. So what's the last animal that you can use? A bird. Turtle dove, pigeons. Some of yours may use slightly different words, but we're talking about small birds. That's what we're getting at here. And so you bring it in, and pretty well you kind of just hand it to the priest. This one's not got a lot to do because it's tiny. Its head is wrung off. It's burnt on the altar. Where do they put the blood, though? As small amount as it is, on the side of the altar. Your blood still must be visible on the side of the altar. And then they can put the rest on. But something gets removed. And this is the first time it's really clear something is removed and something is done with it. There's some possibility of other things being removed and something done with it, but it's unclear at this point. What's removed? The crop. And what do they do with it? They put it in the ashes. What's the cardinal location there? So where are the ashes? As soon as you walk in the door. Think about that. As soon as you walk in the door, you have a pile of ashes here where the undesirables are being deposited, where the ashes are being cleared out of the altar to make room for more ashes. And then you're supposed to be sacrificing. And there's blood all over the place as it's dripping down the side of the altar and soaking into the ground. As these priests who in the morning were clean are not clean by end of day. It's a gross business to have some of your most valuable fabric be mere feet away from it, with some of your most valuable materials being used on it. Any comments anybody has? So that's a burnt offering. Let me make sure I hit everything before I move forward. Let's go to chapter 6. There's a reiteration here. You've got the first 5 chapters go through all of the sacrifices, and then they kind of add a little bit more detail afterwards. Some explanations, a little bit of coloring to help you really understand what's going on. And in Leviticus 6, we're going to take a look just from verse 8 down through verse 13 here, because it's dealing with the burnt offering again. The Lord spoke to Moses. Still having a conversation here. The Lord spoke to Moses, saying, "Command Aaron and his sons, saying, this is the law of the burnt offering." Notice our change here. Who did he talk to in chapter 1? God commanded Moses to speak to whom? The people of Israel. Now God commands Moses to speak to Aaron and his sons. So this is something the priests are going to be doing that the people are not involved in. This is the law of the burnt offering. The burnt offering shall be on the hearth on the altar all night until the morning, and the fire of the altar shall be kept burning on it. The priest shall put on his linen garment and put on his linen undergarment on his body. He shall take up the ashes to which the fire has reduced the burnt offering on the altar and put them beside the altar. Then he shall take off his garments and put on other garments and carry the ashes outside the camp to a clean place. The fire on the altar shall be kept burning on it, it shall not go out. The priest shall burn wood on it every morning. He shall arrange the burnt offering on it, then burn on it the fat of the peace offerings, and so forth and so on. Fire shall be kept burning on the altar continually, it shall not go out. How do you clean a gigantic altar? This is how you do it. Step number 1, the priest has to do something to himself. What does he do? Change his clothes. He doesn't come to work in his work clothes. He puts it on when he gets there. He puts on his linen garments. He puts on his linen undergarments. He is a priest now. Why is it so important that he looks like a priest when he's cleaning the altar? Holiness again, right? There's a set apartness. He is holy. He is touching the holy object. He is touching the holy burned things. Everything here is holy. He is piling the discarded parts, the ashes, which are still holy, next to the altar. So once he's piled them up, what does he have to do? He's got to change his clothes. Why? Because he's no longer going to be separated. His holy business is finished. He puts on his normal clothes to take out the garbage now. Now, it is still special garbage. He described what's the location it's supposed to be taken to. A clean place outside the camp. We're not just throwing it in all of the trash piles. There is still some sanctity to this. There is still holiness to the ashes. But he has made a separation visually. All the people know what he's carrying. It's not going to take long before everybody in the entire camp can recognize the few sons of Aaron. But he's not a priest right now. He's just taking out the ashes. And then when he comes back, he puts his clothes back on, he goes back to work. Anybody have any thoughts on that? I wanted to make sure to add that in because it's burnt offering. It's really all offerings. It even talks about the peace offering there as well. Okay. Let me see if I got anything else I wanted to talk about with that. Let's talk about the grain offering, chapter 2. Let me get somebody to read the first 3. I've been doing a lot of reading. Let somebody else do it. Chapter 2, verses 1 through 3. Yes?
When you anyone brings a grain offering to the Lord, their offering is to be of the finest flour. They are to pour olive oil on it, put incense on it, and take it to Aaron's son, the priest. The priest shall take a handful of flour and oil together with all the incense and burn this as a memorial portion on the altar of food offering and aroma pleasing to the Lord. The rest of the grain offering belongs to Aaron and his sons. It is a most holy part of the food offerings presented to the Lord.
Okay, thank you very much. So here is the grain offering, and we've got the general rule at the beginning, just like we did with the burnt offering, right? The burnt offering, you got to bring something of the herd or the flock has got to be male, general. But with the grain offering, things are a little bit different here, aren't they? First of all, not everything's going to get burned. And second of all, there are no animals, right? I assume flour is not an animal, right? Thank you. Get some reaction. If you want to bring a grain offering, your offering must be of fine flour, he says. First principle. We're going to talk about some exceptions here in just a minute. You pour oil on it. You put incense on it. Some of your translations may say frankincense. That's fine. You bring it to Aaron. You bring it to Aaron's sons, technically. Aaron's probably not doing this. And what do they do with it? Yeah, they sacrifice a handful. Now, it is specific, all the incense has to go with that handful. So we're not talking about a tenth of everything on there, though some scholars try to say that. That's not what it says. It says all the incense has got to go too. But it's still just a handful. You're just scraping off the top and throwing it on. What do they do with the rest of it? It's for the priests. They get to utilize it. Now we're going to talk a little bit more about how they utilize it in just a moment, but just suffice it to say at this point, it's given to the priest. So notice the difference here. A burnt offering is very intimate. It's between you and God. The priest facilitates, but by and large gets nothing out of it. It's not really all that involved except for the fact that they're the one that just kind of makes it happen for you. Grain offering, though, is something that is given to them. It's something that they themselves keep. It is something that is holy at that point in time. Okay, let's muddy the water a little bit. Oh, yeah, comment?
This had to be a great task to get fine flour when they were in the desert.
Yeah. Definitely had to work hard at it. Yeah. So to muddy the water, we've got verses 4 through 10. Because now it doesn't necessarily have to be pure fine flour. He says you could bring a grain offering that's baked in the oven. It needs to be unleavened loaves made of fine flour, so you still got to have it, but it's a loaf now. You need to make sure that you mix in oil. Or you can make unleavened wafers smeared with oil. Or you can bake it on a griddle. Still has to be unleavened, still got to have oil. You break it into pieces, you pour more oil on it. It's an offering. That's still a grain offering. In verse 7, it says that you can cook it in a pan with fine flour and oil. But all of these things, it tells us in verse 8, you bring as a grain offering. You bring it to the priest. He brings it to the altar. He does puts the portion on for God. He takes the rest for himself and for the rest of his brothers. It is a most holy part of the Lord's food offerings. I'm going to reiterate that. That was up there in verse 3. It's down again in verse 10. This is not just a throwaway thing. You're not just feeding the priest like, okay, well, they got to have some lunch, so I guess I'll give them some extra. This is a most holy part. This is part of worshiping God, is giving something to the priests. Any comments before we go a little further? Okay, continuing in verse 11. No grain offering that you bring before the Lord shall be made with leaven. What's the obvious answer of why it cannot be with leaven? What does Jesus tell us about leaven? It represents sin. It represents uncleanness. And so if you're coming to God, you can't bring that. But then he adds a second thing. Leaven, we can get on board with leaven. Like, that's super easy for us. We just get it. It's all over the place. But what's the other thing mentioned in verse 11 that you cannot put on this offering? Honey. Honey is not an oil. Point number one. But why else? Why not put honey on it? Honey is valuable. It tastes really good. Why can't you put honey on it? That's one of the reasons. All over history. I mean, I'm not even going to limit it to the ancient world, but, well, I guess it is still the ancient world when you talk about Rome and Greece, but it's a different kind of ancient world. But yeah, all over the place, you give the best tasting stuff to God. The best of the cakes, the best of the breads. You make it taste really nice, because then the priest can go in and eat really fun, tasty stuff. So it is used all the time, yeah.
That was consumed was fermented honey, mead.
Yep.
It's called mead. So it was used in all
Yeah,
the
it's all over the place.
pagan that they drank, got intoxicated on the honey, the mead.
Yeah. And all these are great answers. And if you read commentaries, they're all going to disagree with each other because, let's be honest, at the end of the day, we don't really know why no honey. We can guess, and we can find really good answers that please ourselves. Find your answer and let it please you. That's the end. There's more that you have to make sure that you're doing, though. You've got your fine flour, you've got your oil, you've got your incense, you have no honey, you have no leaven. But he goes on here, look down in verse 13. You shall season all of your grain offerings with salt. Don't forget the salt. You shall not let the salt of the covenant with your God be missing from your grain offerings. With all of your offerings you shall offer salt. How many times in there does he say don't forget it? Salt must always be there. In fact, once you get into the land and they've got their tabernacle set up or they've got their temple set up, salt is offered with everything, not just a grain offering. Also, grain offerings are offered with everything, so it kind of goes hand in hand. We'll look at that here in a minute if we have time. Salt's everywhere. Read Ezra. Ezra makes sure they have vast quantities of salt on site, just in case. Because salt must be offered. Salt is valuable. But even when Jesus chooses to try to describe his disciples in one of the earliest of the sermons in the New Testament, he describes them as the salt of the earth. Which is kind of interesting that his disciples are required to be a part of every single offering that is pleasing to God by him calling them salt. Any comments anybody has?
The word is our preservative.
Yep. A lot of symbolism with salt. A lot of symbolism.
About the leaven, the honey, the salt. You know, leaven doesn't always mean sin. It actually can mean, well, God calls it the kingdom of God. The kingdom of God's like leaven.
Yeah.
You know, honey is actually a really good thing. You know, they're going to a land of milk and honey.
Yeah.
Salt, you're the salt of the earth, but salt's also a form of judgment. So, you know, all these have a good and a bad. It's just kind of interesting that we're not told why for any of them.
Kind of reminds me of a class, I think it was last week and the week before when we went through Job. A guy who went the entire book saying, I wish that God would explain something to me, and at the end God's like, just do it because I'm God. Just do it because I'm God. Especially from our perspective, because we don't have any of the background culture. They may have understood it perfectly. But definitely a just do it because I'm God. Any other thoughts before we go a little further? Yeah.
That particular period of time, if two tribes had been at war and they decided to make peace, they would eat salt off of the end of the other sword. And then they would say, now that we've eaten this salt, we will never raise our swords against you as long as we live. So they understood
Salt is very
Salt was
important.
a covenant.
Yeah.
Even to the pagans, salt meant, if you ate someone's salt, you had made a covenant with them.
Yeah. All right, next time we're going to go through peace and sin, probably get a little bit into the sin offering, but definitely the peace offering, be prepared for that, and we'll finish off the grain offering at that time as well. Thank you very much.
In the mornings of the